Today, Professor Beth Kaplin will share with us a presentation titled Tropical Biology in the Age of Parachutes and Helicopters, 30 Years of Observations from Rwanda. Beth is director of the Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management at University of Rwanda. She is also a professor in the College of Science and Technology at University of Rwanda. In addition to her position at the University of Rwanda, she's a research professor at University of Massachusetts in Boston in the School for the Environment. She's the current president for the Tropical Biology and Conservation Association, which we are celebrating today, and associate editor for the journal Biotropica. Please welcome Beth to the stage.
Great, thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. I was worried there would be like 2 people here because it's the very end of the day, and if you're like me, I know everyone is very tired. We've been focusing for 4 days, and I think everyone is kind of tired, but it's been a really amazing conference, and I want to thank the organizers. The whole team has done an amazing job, and I've attended some really fantastic talks during this week, and I hope you have too. And I want to start now with my presentation to you. I want to thank the organizers for giving the president slot. It's a nice opportunity to talk about some things that I've been thinking about. So this is a really nice setup because, let's see, I'm going to keep my glasses on so I can look at that down in front of me. I'm going to be talking to you about tropical biology and what is happening with tropical biology in Rwanda and other parts in the African continent, and also my observations of this parachute or helicopter science. If some of you haven't heard of that before, I'm going to be describing it in a moment. And I'll also explain where my observations come from, and then I'm going to relate it back to the ATBC. I'm going to start by talking to you about where my observations come from. So I first went to Rwanda in 1990 to do my master's and then my PhD, and it was because of Tim Mormond. Some of you may know him. He was studying seed dispersal ecology, and especially with birds at that time, and we had a grant from USAID to study seed dispersal. It was animal seed dispersers as key elements for conservation of tropical forests, and this was in Yungwe Forest Reserve, which is an Afro-montane tropical forest. It's now a national park. And we subsequently had NSF grants, but we were not able to continue the research, but I'm going to show you, these are just the 2 species that I focused on. They're Cercopithecus monkeys, and they are mainly known as arboreal fruit eaters, and this species had not previously been systematically studied, so it was very exciting for me to go in and look at what they were doing in the tropical forest and what their role was as seed dispersers. Then after 1994, the genocide against the Tutsi, I did a lot of thinking about what I wanted to do. Did I even want to continue my PhD? It seemed kind of very insignificant and useless at that point. And I also thought a lot about where would I do the rest of my research? Would I look at other Afro-montane, other montane tropical forests, because that's really what I enjoy studying the most, or would I stay working in Rwanda, especially given what had happened in the country? And so I ended up deciding to stay focused in the country, and part of that was I had started going back in 1996, and I was working with WCS. I was continuing to do some research in Yungwe Forest, and I was talking to a colleague and friend, Eugene Rutagarama. He worked with mountain gorilla conservation, and he had won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2001. And he talked to me about focusing on working with it was then called National University of Rwanda. And I worked with the National University of Rwanda to see what they were doing with tropical biology and with biodiversity conservation. And in talking with Eugene Rutagarama, he told me, well, why don't you write this grant to the MacArthur Foundation? So I did, building academic capacity to deliver conservation biology education in Rwanda. And this grant, we got it in 2006. And I served as technical advisor, and we ended up getting 3 cycles of 3-year funding to do this project. And we built bachelor programs and master's programs in conservation biology. They were in the zoology program and the botany program, so they became zoology and conservation and botany and conservation. And they're still running now, and many of our students are working, the graduates are in these, the Ministry of Environment, the Rwanda Forestry Authority, other government agencies, international NGOs, and local NGOs. And that led to the next phase of my relationship with Rwanda. The government, together with especially UNESCO, looked at putting this in this Center of Excellence in Biodiversity and Natural Resource Management, and this center was decided to be placed at the University of Rwanda because of those programs that were training students in undergrad and masters. And previous to that, there had been no training in those fields. And so I was appointed as the first director of the center in 2017, and it's called a Knowledge Management Center. It took me a long time to think about what does knowledge management mean. I'm still kind of working that out. It functions as a consortium of different institutions, and well, I also asked myself, why even a center? You know, a lot of these countries are getting centers of excellence. Well, the reason why this center came to Rwanda is Rwanda is in a biodiversity hotspot. We know biodiversity is incredibly important for national transformation goals, climate adaptation, et cetera. And His Excellency, the President, Paul Kagame, initially proposed this center, and that's how it caught on with the different stakeholders. And there were also noted big gaps in both data availability and the ability to use data to inform policy and management. And so that's why this center came about. And the core functions of the center are research and monitoring, biodiversity informatics, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we do in that area in a moment, and then education and awareness raising, and bioprospecting, or the valorization of biodiversity, and also networking and coordinating institutions in the country, because we function as a consortium. So I've also spent time thinking about what exactly is excellence. What does that mean? How do we operationalize that? And that's still, we're working on that in terms of how we function in these different areas. But our vision in the center is to be an internationally known research institution that makes that science policy linkage, and our mission is to enhance the knowledge of biodiversity and natural resource management through sustainable development. And we recently applied for this UNESCO Category 2 status. All along the way in this journey I've been with Rwanda, I've just constantly learning new things, and so I'm sure in your mind you're thinking, what's a UNESCO Category 2 center? Where I'm still figuring that out myself. We just got the Category 2 status. We had to go through a pretty hefty feasibility study, and we went through the UNESCO General Conference in November, and then we received the official notice just like 3 months ago. So we're still in the process of operationalizing it, but we join a network of these centers that we are required to work regionally, and also there's an emphasis on working with biosphere reserves, but also with the other UNESCO centers. And so now I want to tell you about some of the research projects, which is, I hope, going to set a bit of a foundation for you in terms of the kind of research that we're doing and what is driving or dictating some of that kind of research. And the themes that we work in have to do, first of all, with building taxon expertise. There's about 1 new species found per year in Rwanda, which is a tiny country. And I think that's pretty amazing that there are still new species being found, like a tree, just I think 2 or 3 years ago, a new moss, an orchid, a dragonfly, and I'm going to show you in a moment some ants. But most of that work previously had not been done or driven or done by Rwandans. So that's one of our goals, is to build this taxon expertise, to link it to biological indicators. Are there species that can indicate healthy ecosystems? And also making the biodiversity data available. That's through this information system, so that it can be used for management and land use planning and conservation. And also because agriculture is the major sector in the country, as it is for many countries on the continent of Africa, understanding how we can do agriculture while also protecting biodiversity and actually showing the value of biodiversity in these agricultural systems is a very important part of our research. And then restoration, because there's a lot of restoration work going on right now. We are in the UN Decade of Restoration. There's a huge amount of input, financial input into restoration projects. And I'll be talking about that in a moment too. And then also climate adaptation is a really big emphasis right now, and ecosystem-based adaptation, or this EBA, which I'll also be talking with you more about in a moment. And then this linking science to inform policy. In particular, Rwanda has stated it wants to be a science-driven government, and in that case, it really does want these institutions to be providing science. And, oh, what did I just do? Let's see. These are some of the big global initiatives that sort of drive and dictate some of the themes we work on. During the week, I've heard people referring to the Bond Challenge and the UN Decade of Restoration. Green growth is a really big push right now, funding coming from different sources. Forest landscape restoration is a big issue right now. Of course, the UN Development Goals, and then the funding, the the Green Climate Fund, and then these donors. I've been thinking a lot recently about how much an impact these big donors have on what we do and how we do research and development interventions in the country. And that's UNDP especially, and UNEP, and the World Bank. And I will be showing you one of these projects. There's been some other work written about this for Rwanda and for other countries, but I think this is really a big issue that we need to address, and I hope I'll be unpacking that a bit in this talk. So I want to show you just a few of the projects that we have going on right now. I and my colleagues have had to really get up to speed quickly on what is an information system and how does this work, and it's been really fascinating. We have been funded by the JRS Biodiversity Foundation, and I assure you most of these data are just completely scattered in different sources, and now we have this very dynamic data team that goes after data in unpublished reports and in different data sets. We've been thinking and talking a lot about how we convince people to share data and then get it into the right format, Darwin Core Standard, and get it up into the system, and we're working with GBIF on this as well. And then using, the big thing is showing how to use this information system to inform management decisions and research, tourism, land use development, environmental impact assessments, et cetera. And then, let's see, yep. Did I do that right? Sorry. Another project we have is funded by the Volkswagen Foundation. So it's a partnership with some German partners, and this is focused on building the taxon expertise. So each year for 3 years, and we're in our second year this August, we'll be working with 8 different taxon groups like birds and plants and fish, et cetera, and training researchers. And we really want this to be more than just a one-off training, so we're really trying to get them to then follow up and have some support systems in place where then the research can continue. And we also have, we are managing the National Herbarium of Rwanda, and this is, it came about through kind of I guess I can laugh about the situation of how it came to us. We wrote a grant to Sudexpert plant, and we got funded to upgrade and digitize the National Herbarium. And we did it in collaboration with the partner who is managing that herbarium. It was a government institution. And when we got the grant, they immediately said, "That's so great, we're going to gift you the herbarium." Now, in Rwanda, we really are still rebuilding from the legacy of the genocide, and we don't have people who manage herbaria. That herbarium had been there, and I have the photos of what it looked like and what we've been able to do with it through the grant and bringing over experts, but we're still at the very much the infancy stage with it, and I would say it's a Midland size collection is 20,000 specimens, and we've digitized about half of it so far. But we do a lot with visiting student groups, both from University of Rwanda and other institutions, and we have visiting researchers who come through who have both used the herbarium and then helped us in training and mentoring. And here's a picture of the digitizing stand that we have. And then another project that we have, again, this is a bit dictated by the kind of funding that's coming into the country, is through because of climate change and change in rainfall patterns and the heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture, the country is getting donor funding to put in irrigation projects, and they have environmental and social safeguarding. So we have a team, we were asked by the government to put a team together that would monitor, we're creating right now the baseline data to monitor the impacts of that irrigation on freshwater ecosystems, and of course the data is going into the biodiversity information system. And we've also now been doing water bird counts, and with a lot of small donor funding, but again, wetland ecosystems are very important in the country, and we want to use the information system to hold the data and be able to show the distribution of important water birds and how they may be changing over time with land use change. Another interesting project we have is integrating native species into the timber industry. So if you come to Rwanda and you land in the capital city, Kigali, and you drive across the countryside, you will only see non-native species, and you will only see the native species when you get into a national park, which is quite a sad phenomenon. There's now a lot of talk about getting more native species out there. And what we're trying to do, we made a partnership with a timber company who's very interested in doing timber a little bit differently. And we're trying to look at this as a multifunctional landscape. And then we're converting this into a triple helix model where we're also working with the government, the agency that is actually managing these forest concessions. So we're just at the start of this plant, identifying, procuring the seeds, and then growing them to seedlings and putting them out into the forest. Another project we have somewhat related, what came out of the College of Medicine and colleagues from mental health, looking at having children grow native trees, because again, it's almost impossible to find native species when you're not in the national park. Then we also have a project in partnership with UCLA colleagues where we are, the focus is on rewilding protected areas. I'm going to talk more about this project in a moment in a different context, but it's an eDNA project, and we did this work in Akagera National Park in Rwanda, which is a savanna woodland park. And then a couple of other projects I want to tell you about. One is focused on climate-smart agriculture. I told you that agriculture is one of the dominant sectors in the country, and we really are lacking on research to know how to do agriculture better so it's not so detrimental to biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So we have just started a grant from the African Development Bank, and our interest in this is really to look at biodiversity. So we're also working with agriculture board partners on this end, ECRAF, but we want to focus on the role of biodiversity in these systems, and we're just launching the project at the end of this month. And we just finished another project with partners in university. It's Glasgow Caledonian University in Scotland and partners in Malawi looking at the impacts of COVID and climate change, so dual impacts on rural communities. And another project we have is with a NGO in the UK. And this project is more of a citizen science project linking people to nature. So we are recording, it's actually this woman here is one of the brainchild with one of the top birders in the country recording bird sound, and we're creating a gaming app to get people to play a game to learn bird song, and we're using the audio files in the information system I told you about. And we have another project in partnership with Rhodes University under this African Research University Alliance. So it's an example of a South-South partnership, which is really building capacity for freshwater ecosystems. And I want to tell you also just about where, in addition to the National Herbarium, we are trying to develop sister collection with zoological collections. These are both really important because most specimens don't stay in the country. It's a history up until today, still now. People come to the country and do their research and they're still taking all the specimens out. And often if you catch them and ask, they'll say, well, there was no place to leave them. So we're always saying, well, help us do it right and develop the collection. So this is one of the things that we're focused on. And we also have done this ant course with Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Science. This has been a really neat collaboration where we're trying to build capacity for ant taxonomy, ant sampling. And what I think is really amazing, in 2 weeks in a tiny slice of Nyungwe National Park, which is an Afro-montane forest at fairly high elevation, 1,600 to 3,000 meters, they found potentially 13 new species, new to science, and overall they've got at least 74 species they found in this one small slice. And in a few months they're going to be going to Akagera National Park, which is in the dry savanna woodland region, to repeat this project. And I think this is the last example of a project that we're working on is with, it's called this Least Developed Countries University Partnership, and it crosses all countries, least developed countries across the globe. And what I think is neat about this project is it's trying to build capacity in these countries to do the climate adaptation so that it's not focused on international consultants to do this work. And so what we're doing in our center is going to be working with the government to build the capacity to study climate adaptation and also write the grants that get that where all this money is being mobilized for climate adaptation funding. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about this project we did, which I think is an example of how some of this research tropical biology work goes. This is ecosystem-based adaptation. It's being funded by UNDP and possibly other agencies, but they're moving around different countries in Africa and I think other countries. I know that there's a project in Colombia actually on ecosystem-based adaptation. But what it means is it's doing two things. It's addressing climate change, and in particular ecosystem functioning and the maintenance of ecosystem services under climate change, at the same time as improving human well-being or working with communities to build their adaptive capacity. And so some of the examples here are maybe working in riparian zones, working with forest fragments, and trying to restore those ecosystems, and then also paying attention to how communities interact with those ecosystems. And these are some of the supposed benefits that should come out of doing this ecosystem-based adaptation work. So it could be making sure that there's a provision of clean water, flood control, erosion control, et cetera. And in Rwanda, this project rolled out under a title of Building Resilience of Communities Living in Degraded Areas. So degraded ecosystems were selected. I mainly want to say, this spread across, there's a lot of, I don't know what happened to that. There was funding and a lot of communities that were involved in this project. And I don't know what happened to this slide. This is not how it looked when I loaded it up. But it was a table showing the projects in Rwanda. So what I mainly wanted to show you here is the projects were agroforestry projects and also riparian zone projects and forest wetland and forest projects. And what the other thing I want to mention is what's unique about this is the agency that was managing this project, instead of going to an international consultant to do the project, they asked to work with a center and to work with students. So they worked with students to do the evaluation research with mentors from the university. And so they were getting two things out of this, building research capacity and getting the evaluation results. And some of the things I wanted to point out, if the main sites were forests, wetlands, and agroforestry. But the problem is a lot of what was planted was non-native species. Most of the jobs that people reported they got jobs were short-term jobs to do the tree planting, but after that, there's not jobs. But the other important thing is that people were then excluded from accessing the resources, which really goes against what ecosystem-based adaptation was supposed to do. Remember, I said there were two objectives. It was restoring ecosystems and improving human well-being. And people also complained that they got poor quality seedlings, or a lot of times the seedlings died. And by the way, most of them were non-native. There was a lot of bamboo planting. It was Chinese bamboo. When you go to Rwanda, you can see a lot of bamboo along riparian zone and thick monodominant stands in riparian zone, which is from China. And this was done under ecosystem-based adaptation. So we can ask, were ecosystems really restored? And just some pictures of what that looked like. There was some inundation happening along the areas where they did the planting, but they planted like a banana tree, and then here's some of this little bamboo that they planted scattered along in this area. And when you look in the literature about what ecosystem-based adaptation projects were supposed to do, they were supposed to help people adapt to climate change, and they're supposed to contribute to biodiversity conservation and maintenance of ecosystem services. And that's part of this overall adaptation strategy. And what I think is also interesting about the ecosystem-based adaptation approach is it is supposed to take into account traditional knowledge. It is supposed to even have a component of co-management or co-production of knowledge, and involving many different stakeholders, in particular the local or community stakeholders. And there's supposed to be this research component, but we had very little control over any of this because it was really driven by the donor and the government partner, and I hope none of them are sitting in the audience now. We've tried to have conversations with them about it, but it's a little bit difficult. But the main thing that we found, or in the recommendations we wanted to make, one was about, what's interesting is it's very difficult to get baseline data. And so they will say we did baseline data. This was done before we got involved. But you really can't do good evaluation research without the baseline data. And even having it in a platform that it's accessible. And then also knowing ahead of time what are going to be your indicators to know that you achieved what you meant to achieve in ecosystem-based adaptation. And also this big issue of monetizing the costs and benefits, because it's needed to have a component of improving human well-being. And then the technical support, this was related to so much of the failure of the agroforestry plantings in these systems, and also how to deal with people being excluded from the areas, whether they were going into a riparian zone to collect fodder or medicinal plants, for example, and also the issue of participation. So across the board, people said, yeah, we were told what was happening, but we really didn't participate in how the projects were chosen, what species would be planted, and other aspects of the project. So overall, what's really missing is an understanding of what is ecological restoration and where learning fits into doing these projects and the co-production of knowledge, and also the important component of community involvement, which I also heard during some of the talks that I sat in on during this week. And so I want to get back to that original question I was asking about what is going on with tropical biology on the African continent. In particular, why are there so few first authored papers? And so I was showing you a context of how some of this work is rolling out. So this may be projects that are not necessarily arising from theory, but definitely need to have a theoretical component when you're talking about climate adaptation, ecosystem restoration, human livelihood improvement, et cetera. And Emilio's talk this morning showed, and you can see so many examples. We looked at the Biotropica report where you can see just a real lack of authorship coming from the African continent, despite the fact that it is holding some of the wonderful biodiversity hotspots. And so some of the things that I've noticed, first of all, within academia, which is where I've been focusing my work in Rwanda, that we are at a stage of often just talking about what is a research culture. We get a lot of funding, for example, from the Swedish government, and they're always asking us, you know, what are you doing to build a research culture? And that's a really big question for us. We did a rapid shift from a teaching college to a research college, and our research focus is often, it really needs to be driven by what the national priorities are. We have very few PhDs, and post-grad training is very, very new, just in the last like 5 to 8 years. We have tremendous issue with brain drain. We're still plugging holes in ministries, so when we get PhDs, they get taken up, the good ones get taken up by the ministries. We have language issues and funding issues. And as far as research, the quality of the tropical biology training is a big issue. And also, I just pick out this example of restoration, where the theory I don't think is really being taught, and then that is not getting embedded into how these projects are happening across the country. The lack of social science training. A lot of these governments have committed to STEM and are really big on STEM at the expense of the social sciences, which I think is incredibly important in the work we're doing here. And also just limits in how we get our people to conferences. Even getting visas is sometimes impossible, and how to do evaluation research. And then the issue of the lack of really durable partnerships, which are also, I'm going to talk about that more in a moment. But there's a legacy of colonialism, which I think is having an impact on everything that we do. And also in the context of a resource-poor areas, you can see from this graph, and the quality of education. And many of these countries are going through issues, political turmoil, that have affected their ability to provision really good quality education. And the other issue is this Western privilege, which often takes over in some of the things that we're able to do. And I'm just showing quickly, we were visiting recently some of the museums and facilities in Belgium, where they're hosting like huge amounts of information, data from Rwanda. So does this really matter? And you know, does anybody really care about this? Well, yes, I argue it's incredibly important. About 17% of the world population is on the continent of Africa. And what does it mean when we don't have these voices in our work as scientists and as contributing science to policy? And especially when we're talking about biodiversity hotspots. And I want to now talk a little bit about what can be done about this. Well, I think we definitely need durable, real partnerships. I'm going to talk about what I mean there. Also, there's issues with permits that we can do, and then researchers who can contribute. By durable partnerships, what I mean is I'm going to explain it by some of these examples of papers. There's been a lot of papers coming out recently. This one about time to end helicopter research, avoiding parachute science, 10 simple rules. And essentially, it's trying to argue about why avoid going into a country to do your research and leaving. And this quote, just one part of it, the focus, although collaborations exist between developing world scientists and developed world scientists, too many of these collaborations are not deep or permanent, and developing world scientists are too often relegated to a subordinate role. I am seeing this happening all the time. We still have many botanists who come to the country, and then we find out through a publication that they do a year or two later about what they found, and there's nothing left in the country, no herbaria, no various specimens, et cetera. So sometimes you would think that that would not still be happening. But I want to give you some really amazing examples we have. These partners from UCLA and UC Santa Cruz with a project. This was, a large part of this was research capacity building. And we did in-class training and lab training on eDNA methods, and then we did the field work together. And really the idea was that this would not be a one-off training, and this was really an amazing partnership, and I think this is really going to continue on with some further studies. This ant course I told you about, this was also really amazing because the group got along so well that we had trainers from Belgium, Ivory Coast, and Spain, and with the Rwandan, and we had some researchers from, I think, DRC and maybe another country, I don't remember. But they put in another grant. They're doing some papers together, and they're going to be sampling again in another part of the country. So this was what I would call a durable, real partnership as well, and they're doing the naming together. They're doing the systematics together. Another example I can give is about study abroad programs. We get so many study abroad programs coming into the country, and sometimes it kind of breaks my heart because these groups come in and we can't get our students out. We don't have the money, the resources. They even go to go see the president, and our students are still like, you know, we're nowhere near that. But we've finally gotten some of the professors bringing the groups over to come and spend some time and have this sort of experience with students in the country. So yes, they're accessing, you know, WCS and all these other NGOs and talking about what's going on and maybe in the government. They're hearing all the great success stories. But when they meet with the students, I think something else happens when the students talk to each other. And these are just some examples. They had some small breakout group discussions. Another thing I did with another group that came is they were doing some sampling, and I asked them, you know, could you leave the equipment? I mean, you can't imagine what it's like to procure equipment in a country like Rwanda. It can take 2 or 3 years to get equipment you want, and it's often like 2 to 3 times the cost because it's really an absurd process. But another example we had was this woman here came to do her PhD, and she gave a training and lectures to students, and then she took a couple of the students into the field with her and trained them. And for them, it was quite a transformative experience. She's been continuing to mentor them even several years after that happened. And here is, another professor who came with a group of students and intentionally spent time meeting with our students and did field work together with them. These are some of the things that can be done to create these real partnerships. And one thing I noticed what's happening in Rwanda is they're dealing with this issue through affiliation requirements. So the permit agencies require an affiliation, but I think we need to really look at, are those affiliations really turning into durable partnerships? And also the permit is requiring, we're working with the government to make sure the permits require that the researchers do leave specimens in the, replicate specimens or duplicate specimens in the country, which does seem like a no-brainer, but as I said, is still not often happening. And also contributing beyond specimens just to other things like maybe equipment or offers of mentoring so that they can get beyond these one-off studies where there can be follow-ups among our colleagues in the host countries. And I think this is important for ATBC because, as I mentioned, about 17% of the world's population is found on this continent. And ATBC has been really working hard on DEI, which is really great to see, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think that this is an issue that we can really start looking into more deeply, and not just for the continent of Africa, but other countries where we are working. And so I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today and talk to you about what I've been observing with tropical biology in Rwanda. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have a bit of time for some questions.
Thank you, Beth. That was wonderful. I'm surprised that you didn't mention anything about the ATBC Africa chapter, which at least was active several years ago, and it really was starting to gain a lot of ground and provide another source of capacity development and activity for scientists in Africa. Can you speak about
I'm
that?
sorry, Robin. I guess my talk was really focused on this experience in Rwanda, but you're absolutely right. There is an Africa chapter, and maybe that's for a different context, but yes, they have been, there's many organizations. SCB also is doing a lot of work with African colleagues. And I think the Africa chapter is also quite active, of ATBC. So yes, and they've been running seminars, and they're planning another meeting in Africa. So yes.
Fantastic, Beth. I'm breathless at the scope and variety of things that you're doing there. It seems overwhelming. But I just wanted to comment. I've worked in a developing country for 50 years, and we've seen various stages. When I started in the 60s, there were no wildlife regulations. There was no need for scientific permits. There wasn't a government bureaucracy that administered such things. There were only 1 or 2 national parks, and they were mostly neglected. And over time, there've been steady progress, so that by the 1980s or by early 1990, which is when you started in Rwanda, the system was up and running. There wasn't yet a Ministry of the Environment, but there is now. But the responsible government agency issued permits in a timely fashion. They required all permitted investigators to submit reprints as a condition of receiving a second authorization the following year. We're obliged to deposit half of our specimens of plants or whatever in national institutions. So the machinery for doing all that took a while to develop, but now is in, you could say, a mature state and working more or less as intended. But it sounds to me like Rwanda is at the stage that Peru was in the 60s or 70s and hasn't yet institutionalized all these functions.
Well, that's a good comment. I think Rwanda has, and I remember even, for example, Botswana, this maybe like, if somebody works in Botswana would know this, it was like 6 years ago or 5 years ago, they actually closed to all research because some researchers were coming in and not doing what you're saying. So they had those regulations and they found people were not adhering to them. And I have colleagues, for example, who are working in Volcanoes National Park, and there were some issues or misunderstandings, and then the government may close, didn't allow them to do research for a while. So that there is a system in place, but the problem is that there's not always that link with, I know like I think in South American countries it's more advanced in the sense of linking the research to the institutions, for example, herbaria or universities, and we didn't have that in Rwanda until fairly recently. And I tell you, I recently, just 8 months ago, was working with some researchers, and they got quite angry that they, couldn't do whatever they wanted to do. And they didn't want to have any controls over what they were doing, what they were collecting, and we really had to have, because in Rwanda it's also very controlled. It's where you can go and how you go into the forest, because there's a lot of security issues. So that was also really surprising. I mean, I think from the other side, there's some researchers who don't understand the importance of that. So we still have some really big name researchers that aren't leaving specimens, which I just find it shocking, really, why there's not an interest in building up the capacity in the country by leaving specimens and talking to people about there they are, and then, you know, the opportunity to follow up on those populations, for example. So I think some of the systems are in place, but it's a bit of a two-way street, yeah.
Hi, I would like to hear your perspective about what kind of response you receive when you talk about scientific colonialisms to other researchers. Like, do they take it well, or just like they are not that receptive enough?
Do you mean from Rwanda, for example, or you mean?
No, from outside researchers, like top-level researchers or something like that.
I think Rwanda is a bit complicated in the sense that it, you know, sort of what John was mentioning, there was a bit of a free-for-all earlier, and, you know, we did have some researchers who always had it was more based on personal relationships, so they were coming in and they really felt like they were the gift to the country for identifying these species, and they didn't want to be told that they had to leave things. So it is a bit difficult working with them, but some of it's a little bit more subtle. Like, people will say, yeah, I do want to collaborate, but recently we had this example where the researchers, they were working with a team and it was somehow collaborative, but then they left with the material under the material transfer agreements. That was all done. But they did all of the work sending the material out to partners, you know, in Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, to do the sampling without bringing along the Rwandan partners who could have been there, like, observing how that's done. Because you may not even think about it or think it's a small thing, but that's an incredibly important part of showing these early career researchers who have never done this before, how to do that. So I realized that we should have made an agreement that said, you know, simple things like you should CC that person on the email when you're communicating. We're going to have this real collaboration where we show people how this is done. And what we got was an email just saying, here's what we found. It was kind of disappointing. It was like, well, I wish they could have been involved in, you know, our researchers in Rwanda could have been involved in the whole process.
Also, I would like to know, but let me think about it. Do you think that the researchers are receptive enough, or just they are not responding well to that kind of vision of scientific colonialism?
Well, I guess I'm an eternal optimist, so I do think that they will eventually understand, because I think they're good scientists, and we need them, and we need those partnerships. So I often think, you know, what I think about is we should have done a better job of making the agreement. We did the material transfer, we did all the other stuff, but it didn't occur to us to really spell out exactly what we meant through this, what I'm calling like this durable, real partnership. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Okay, I think that's all the time we've got for questions. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.